yourself so we know this is who you are.
Okay. I'm Teedie COWIE Woodcock from Medford, Oregon.
Okay. The first thing is, why were you in the Philippines? Why were your parents in the Philippines? And where were you at the time of Pearl Harbor?
I went to the Philippines in April of 1941, just barely prior to the war. My father was the director of the Coast and Geodetic Survey, and I was the youngest of 5 children. All my siblings were in the United States, and I was the only one who was still in school, so I was the only one who went with them. So we just got out there in spring before the war. I was in Manila on Pearl Harbor Day.
What were your circumstances like in Manila?
Pretty comfortable. Manila was a very colonial type existence, lots of playtime and lots of servants, and heading towards wonderful decadence. It was a very lovely life. Filipinos were marvelous people, and life was pleasant.
Did you have any concerns before Pearl Harbor that something terrible was going to happen, or maybe we should be running off, or?
I had no concerns. I was just too frivolous, I think, at the time to be even vaguely concerned. But I have come on some letters that my father wrote to one of my sisters who wanted to come out and join us. And he said that things are just too problematical at the moment. I think maybe it'd be best if you did not come. So perhaps he had an inkling that something was pending, but it never trickled down to me.
Was he part of kind of the top line of U.S. officials?
I don't know whether you'd call it exactly the top line of officials. He was the top of his particular bureau. Conserve is little understood. They are commissioned officers. They're part of the uniformed service, but they're unarmed, which is why I suppose he was permitted to go out there, because he was not, the Army was just leaving, the Navy was just leaving, all the Army and Navy families, had just left. But I guess they figured that we were not military. So he was director of the Coast and Geodetic Survey. There were, I think, 3 or 4 other officers and quite a few civilians.
When the Japanese took over, your father was not treated as a military man.
My father was killed in the bombing of Manila the day before Christmas, before the Japanese came in.
Who was bombing?
Japanese were bombing Manila.
The harbor, or the...
He was down in the port area. He was on land. He had gone down there to see about getting a pressure pump for something to make nautical charts, and he was getting this to take out to the island of Corregidor. And he happened to be in the Bureau of Printing and Engraving when the Bureau received a direct hit, and he was killed. That was the 24th of December, 41.
Very sad Christmas.
It wasn't the greatest.
After your father had been killed, what did you think was going to happen to you and your mom?
I don't know that we really had a clue what might happen. I think we figured we'd probably be taken out by the Americans and sent back, get us out of harm's way. But there wasn't time, because as you know, the Japanese came in on the 2nd of January, which was only about a week after Dad was killed. So we had no options but just to wait, the 2 of us, and see what was going to happen to us.
In that time that you were there, did you have employees of the survey or servants, people on the outside, people, Filipinos, who could then help you? And
You mean when we went into camp?
right.
No, not really. Our servants were fairly new to us. So many of the people who had lived there forever, these people had been retainers ever since they were young people. But Mother and I didn't have any fruitful contacts outside. There was one man, Angel de Jesus, who tried to help, but he was pretty tied up himself with activities.
And what about, having money, resources, proved to be very helpful for some. What was your situation?
Not as good, because we didn't have some of the contacts outside. Like, there were a lot of Swiss and Germans and Chinese who were very, very helpful to some of these people. They would take promissory notes and things. But Mother and I didn't have that kind of contact. Most of the people that we knew were also in camp, or the men had been taken away. So we didn't really fare quite as well as some of the others might.
Was that bothersome?
Well, I suppose I had a little bit of healthy envy, but no, not bothersome, no. She and I were together, and that was the important thing.
Were you both pretty healthy?
Yes.
Throughout the time?
Well, she was losing at a rather alarming rate. By the time we were liberated, she was losing about a quarter of a pound a day. And she had dropped already 65 pounds. I was, fairly young, athletic, healthy female, so I held up pretty well.
What jobs did you and your mother have in the camp?
I was on the serving line, and she was on the vegetable cleaning detail, mostly.
For years?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So they didn't rotate jobs?
No, you could take other jobs, or you could transfer laterally if you wanted to, but she did quite a bit of sewing also. Somehow or another, I guess the American or the Philippine Red Cross must have gotten these sewing machines in the first year. I'm sure you've heard about those. There were probably a half a dozen of them, and she would mend for men who had no wives in camp. Just, repair things that were torn.
Talk about school. First of all, how old are you, and what school did you come from, and then what was school like once you got into the camp?
At this point in time, I am 81. I was 17 when I went into prison camp, and I was 20 when I got out. I was a senior at American school. And most of our teachers were also imprisoned. My French teacher was not. I'm not sure why. She was apparently committed to some other country than one that was an alien to Japan. That's about it. My teachers were all in camp.
Once you were in camp, did it make any difference what school you came to? Were there little cliques?
No. Except that we knew more people from our own school, but we soon, over a period of time, you expand that horizon quite a bit.
How many high school students? Could you guess?
I don't know. In my graduating class, I think there were 16, but I couldn't give you an estimate.
Talk about your graduating class, or your graduation.
Well, I graduated in June of 1942, the very first year we were in camp. And I don't know, most of the things I remember are so comical, because we gathered together, we young people gathered together and said, really, you're supposed to do something mischievous when you graduate from high school. So what can we do that isn't going to harm anybody? And we had to have lights out at 10 o'clock. So one of the gals somehow got a hold of a cigar, and we sat there and all smoked that cigar and just felt so devilish and knew we'd get in trouble if anybody knew about it. Silly, but it was our little revolt.
Was there a ceremony?
There was. It was pretty superficial, but yes. We didn't get the diplomas that they got in 43 and 44. We just got a little card that was signed by the people who were members of the Board of Education. And so that was then recognized for people who came back to this country and then went on to college. It was accepted.
After you graduated from high school, were you now an adult and now expected to do adult duties?
No.
Or act like an adult? Or
No, I was expected to act like an adult from the beginning. No, I took a few extra courses just frivolously, just because they were fun. I took a course on, I studied shorthand, I studied dialectics, and just various other things that were entertaining or interesting to me.
how did people decide what courses were going to be offered?
Well, it's a curious thing, and the reading that I've done, I understand this is true of other prison camps. People don't want to stagnate. They don't want to vegetate, and so somebody may have a discipline of accounting and say, you know, I'll take a bunch of people and teach them accounting, or French, or something. And so word gets around. I don't remember, there may have been sign-ups. I don't remember the technical details of it. But it was a learning experience. I'm carrying that on into my late life now. In Oregon, we have the Southern Oregon Learning and Retirement Program in Ashland, Oregon. And a lot of educators, people who are retired teachers or businessmen, teach classes, not for credit, just to keep your mind expanded a little bit.
Describe a typical day once you were out of school, so maybe in 1943. What would be a typical day?
Well, you get up fairly early. Had roll call twice a day. Roll call, as I recall, was 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm not certain, in which we would line up and be counted. And we would stand in line to get our breakfast, which was lugao. I'm sure somebody must have described lugao to you.
Describe it again.
You take rice and you cook it till it's just a paste. And in the first couple of years, Mother and I would try to flavor this with maybe some stick cinnamon or something like that. Then the last year, the only flavoring we had was garlic. So we would start our day with lugao and garlic. And then when they ran out of things to make coffee or tea out of, they said, have a cup of hot water anyway, because it's good for your digestive system. So we would have that. And then a lot of the day was spent in cleanliness, keeping our sleeping quarters clean and our bed linens clean and ourselves clean, so that we didn't have bed bugs that were going to be transported to our neighbors. In the room that I was in, we have a space 6 feet by 4 feet, and there was a one line going down the center of the room that we attached our mosquito net to, so that if the lady next to you had bed bugs and didn't keep her bed clean, her bed bugs could get up on that central wire and come down and gravitate towards the rest of us.
Tell me about bed bugs, because I don't. What causes them? What are the results of having them?
They don't infect. I don't think they carry diseases, but they bite. They usually bite in a nice little straight line. They hide in hidden crevices in chairs, beds, anything. And they mostly come out at night, and they just chomp their way along.
So it's that the bedding isn't aired, the bedding isn't washed.
It's not so much the bedding. I mean, this would be in chairs too. In the corridors, we had a few the old-fashioned desk chairs where there was an arm on it that you could write on, and any time there was a groove, a place where things could come together. They're very, very flat. They're very flat-bodied, and so they could go into that. And as soon as you sit there and put your arm down, why they say, "Ooh, there's a warm body," they come out and start biting. And we had tongue and groove beds. They were slatted tongue and groove, and of course, naturally, the very technicalities of this, there are pockets of places that are bare, where the joints come together, and the bed bugs stay in there. So the way that Mother and I tried to get rid of ours was, because we had no disinfectants or anything, about once a month we would take our beds down to the plaza in front, and you hold a candle under the joint, and then the bed bugs come out, and then you just squash them. That's the best you can do.
Wow. Now, before the war, how were bed bugs dealt with?
I have no idea. Didn't ever come in contact with them. I'm sure they had them, but we didn't. We lived in a very nice apartment, and it was very clean.
Wow. Okay, get back to your day.
Okay. I would say that the morning was pretty much spent cleaning our sleeping quarters and clothing and bodies. The heat of the afternoon, we usually took a little siesta. I think probably we slept more than we sometimes would have ordinarily. The first couple of years we had athletic activities. I played baseball and I played basketball. Not well, but I played. The third year we didn't quite have the energy for that, so we didn't do quite so much of it. And we did a lot of reading. We just, I suppose, what they call hang out.
Was there a library at Santo Tomas that you had access to?
Interestingly, I noticed some of the people talking about this last night. They were so glad that some people had brought things in. I think the YMCA sent books in too, and we did. We had a little library, and it was a great saving. It was
Were there
wonderful.
librarians and library cards and stuff?
No, I think it was pretty much an honor system, as I recall. I mean, I'm willing to be corrected on that, but I don't know.
And where did you read? In bed?
No, mostly in the hallways, just in those chairs that I was talking about. Just sit out in the hallway or outside under the tree, take your patati out there and sit down under a tree and read. It was very, very hard to have solitude. Couldn't be alone much.
Okay, so now you've had your siesta and it's early evening.
And we're getting ready for the second meal of the day, the final meal of the day.
Wait. Breakfast and dinner?
Yeah.
What did you do at noon?
Well, the first 2 years we had lunch, but the third year we didn't have any noontime meal. And you try to take as long as you can to eat because it satisfies you more. You eat slowly and you feel more full. So we stand in line and we get our dinner and we eat our dinner and clean up. You have to clean up your dishes.
Did you keep your dishes in your room? Or
Yes.
were they your personal?
Our own personal one, yeah. So, I don't know whether anybody has described to you someplace along the line, because so many people were getting enteritis, dysentery of one kind and another. They said, we have got to get some hot water for these people to clean their dishes with. So this one man or men got together and they put together a bin where that was divided into 3 sections. The first section, you rinsed the food particles, of which there were practically none, off your plate. The second one was a bin with a basket in it where you had hot soapy water. And the next one was a bin where you had clear hot water for rinsing. And it was kind of interesting because as I explained, we tried to eat slowly. So you had a little bit of a paradox of trying to eat slowly but still be first in line while the water was still hot. Didn't work too well.
Excuse me. What about supplemental things other than just what was handed out in the food line?
Well, Mother and I didn't fare quite as well as some of the other people. And I don't know exactly how this worked, but we were supposed to put our money into, what money we had, into what they called the Bank of Taiwan, and then they let us have it back at, I think, 25 pesos a month. I forget the details on that. And when they were still having these vendors coming in the first couple of years, why we could buy supplemental bananas or peanut butter, avocados, calamansis, things like that. But the last year, she and I didn't have too much to supplement. But it's like Jane mentions in her diary, you don't feel hunger, you don't sense hunger because it's so much a part of your life that it doesn't have a distinction from not being hungry.
And probably it's gradual.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really, yeah.
Okay, so you've had your dinner and you washed
Usually,
your
yeah, usually we...
utensils. Did you hang them up then? Did you?
Yes, we had a communal clothesline. We all hung things on this one central line. It was, the lines were fairly close together, but the sun still got to them. And I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but have they discussed menstrual cycles with you?
No.
Okay. We did the same as probably our grandmothers did. We had like bird's eye fabric that you rolled up and put into kind of like pockets, and then you had to wash them and hang them on this communal line, and in order to distinguish yours from the other girls, you had to embroider your name on yours. So everybody knew when you were having your period. But you know, that the last 6 months we didn't have periods anyway. Your body just didn't produce enough. But we just hung our sheets and things like that out on the communal line and our clothing. But no hot water.
How much honor was there in terms of putting something out and you knew it would be there when you came back?
My personal experience, it was incredible. People respected your space and your possessions. Now I have heard of other people whose circumstances weren't quite that honorable, but Mother and I had no problems. Never had anything stolen, never anticipated having anything stolen, never looked covetously at anybody else's. When you get in a confined space, there's kind of an invisible wall that goes up. You try not to invade the other person's space, mentally or physically.
Being a teenager, did you have special teenage activities or places where you would gather, or?
Sort of, yeah. Yeah, like I say, the first 2 years we had quite a few athletic activities, and we had baseball teams, and we had to practice, things like that. And we had, boy-girl activities. You'd sit around with your boyfriend and spend the evening talking.
Did you have a boyfriend?
I did. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, he was a little bit older than I was, but he was a very delightful fellow.
Did you ever have dances?
They did. They did have dances, yes. And I don't know the details of how those were arranged or who put them on. Probably Dave Harvey made all the arrangements. And Donald Rudder, I know, Don Rudder had something to do with the music that was finally allowed to be played. But they had dances, yeah.
How about, who was Dave Harvey?
Dave Harvey was our primary entertainer. He was wonderful. He kept a lot of us from going stir crazy, I think. He was a professional entertainer.
And what did he do?
He would put on shows.
Put on shows?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a little
like talent
stage.
shows?
Yeah, something like that. Or very gifted people would get up there and maybe sing or dance or tell jokes or something like that.
Did the Japanese come to these?
Once in a while, I think they did, yes. Mm-hmm. I think they did.
Were there rules of what you could do and what you couldn't do in terms of entertainment?
Well, it was just good taste, mostly.
But the Japanese didn't set down
No.
rules? No. How much sense did you have, well, we'll talk about before the last year, that basically your world was controlled by rules made by other Americans? And how much was controlled by rules made by the Japanese?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. I would say it was mostly made by Americans who had filtered the Japanese rules, because the Japanese did have restrictions and limits. But then the Americans would apply them to us, cultural distinctions and things like that. Like no public displays of affection. This is not common to Americans, but the Japanese said there will be no public displays of affection, and so the Americans said to us, no public displays of affection. I don't care if you're married or what. So,
Where was the line drawn? Little children?
I'm sure that was okay. No, this was more of a
Once you're
older
an adult.
person. Yeah, no kissing or hand-holding publicly.
Can you think of anything else like that that was restricted and you felt it was the Japanese way of doing things?
Well, of course, the bowing.
Talk about bowing.
We were taught how to bow correctly in the proper Japanese fashion with hands at the side. And whenever we saw a Japanese soldier, we were supposed to bow to him. It was just a respect thing. It didn't feel good to us because it felt more humiliating than just respectful. And let's see, what else might there have been? Can't think of it offhand.
Did you speak any Japanese?
No.
I mean, so no one ever said, and say Ohio gozaimasu, you know.
No.
So it was just
I
that
never got that involved.
silent bow.
Silent bow.
Talk about the roll calls. Just what was it like? Who did them? And
Well, each room had a room monitor, and she was the one who taught us how to bow properly. And then during these roll calls, we would line up outside our rooms, and if a Japanese officer came around, she would say, "Ready? Bow," and we would all bow in unison until he had passed, and then we'd bob up again.
aha. And did he count you?
I think the room monitor, said, you know, there are 42 people or whatever the number was.
Were you ever frightened for your own safety?
I was frightened for my mother's longevity at the last, because she was starting to lose weight too fast, and I just couldn't figure in my mind, couldn't relate how long her lifespan was going to be. This was scary, but I was never frightened of the Japanese physically, no.
Did you ever purposely break the rules just because you were a teenager?
Not because I was a teenager, just because I was a person. You know, we weren't supposed to have diaries. And as you know, I did these cartoons in camp, and sometimes they didn't seem like they were too flattering to the Japs, so I would hide them when we were having an inspection or something like that. Hope they didn't get found. So I would say, yeah, you break the rules a little bit, but not dramatically. Just no purpose in it.
Well, I had just heard that story of the kids who used to meet at midnight to have their midnight snack, and she explained that there were lots of them doing that.
I wasn't one of them. No, lights out at 10 o'clock was good enough for me, so I'm a rule follower. Rules don't bother me. I mean, I figure they're made for a reason, and once the reason has been explained, why, it's perfectly fine. I drive on the right-hand side of the street. I use my blinker signals, and, you know, I don't get anybody else in trouble.
Talk about Liberation Day.
It was incredible. It was just totally unbelievable, the day that we were liberated, the night that we were liberated. We could see these lights playing around outside and hear gunfire. I personally was not aware of the fact that the Americans were that close. I know there were a lot of people in camp who did know it, but I didn't. And so when these tanks came crashing through the front gate, it was just a total shock to me. One wonderful story that I'm quite proud of as an American is that Lieutenant Abiko went out with his hands up when these tanks came in, but these fellows had been fighting in jungles for like 3 years or something, and they recognized a hand grenade when they saw it. And so they shot him, shot Lieutenant Abiko. And as he was lying there injured, Dr. Stevenson, he was a Presbyterian missionary doctor, I believe, he had been put in our little camp jail by the Japanese in January for signing death certificates that people had died of malnutrition or starvation. And the Japanese said, no, you can't say that, you got to come up with a different reason. And he wouldn't do it, so they put him in this little jail. And that night, the soldiers or somebody in power, took him out of the jail, and he was the one who ministered medically to Abiko as he lay dying. And I just was so proud of him.
Who was Lieutenant Abiko?
He was the commandant of Santo Tomas at that time.
And so he actually did go out with a grenade, or he
He had his hands in the air like he was surrendering, but he had the grenade in his hand, and these guys recognized it, so they shot him.
Oh my.
I guess he was going to go out trying, take a few Americans with him.
Yeah, well, in the film, the Filipino man who talked about the Japanese threw a grenade over the wall, and one of the guerrilla guides was killed. So they knew that these guys had grenades and were, that
Yeah.
might be what they were doing. Interesting. What happened after liberation? Did you immediately leave the Philippines?
No, it was quite a while. They were still fighting. They fought for another 3 weeks, I think, as Manila was destroyed. I'm sure you saw that film, well, you gave it to us, of the horrible destruction of Manila. So there was no place for us to go, really. So we stayed in camp until, let's see, we were liberated the 3rd, and Mother and I stayed there until pretty close to the middle of March, I think. And, of course, then they were feeding us by then, and we were reacting to that. In my case, wholesomely, and my mother, she did get quite sick from all that rich food. And then we were flown down to Tacloban at Leyte and got aboard the Admiral Caps and sailed on home. And the war was still on. So we had a destroyer escort, and we zigzagged back. Got back to San Francisco in April. Can't remember the date.
Where did you go home to?
I had 2 sisters who were in the Navy who were stationed in Washington, D.C., and that had been my dad's last assignment point, so we went back there, stayed with them.
Now I want you to tell your story about how your sisters had all served and you were just one extra.
Yes, well, my mother had this wonderful flag, or a little banner, whatever you call them, that they used to post in the windows. And you'd have a gold star for somebody who died in service and a blue star for somebody who was serving. And my mother had a gold star for my dad and 4 blue stars for my 3 sisters and my brother, who were all serving. And then there was nothing for me. I didn't serve, I didn't die. And I felt a little guilty, I think, that I hadn't contributed to the welfare of my country. But I had 2 sisters in the Navy and 1 in the Coast Guard, and my brother was in the Army in Europe.
And they all came home?
They all came home. They all...
Yeah, except for your dad.
Yep.
Like the rest of the family. Did you find it difficult to explain to people what you'd done when you went looking for a job or when you went to college?
Yeah. It was very difficult. It wasn't something I was terribly proud of, and I didn't particularly want people to know about it. So I just didn't make much explanation. I didn't go to college. I went to business school and started work right away.
And then just didn't talk about it?
Right.
What about your mom? How did she handle the aftermath?
She didn't talk about it either, but my mother was a very lovely, very spiritual lady who never looked on the dark side of things, never complained, never said anything bad about the Japanese. She very seldom said anything bad about anybody. But she never seemed to harbor any bitterness. She didn't harbor any bitterness over the fact that she had been widowed so young. She was only 51. And 2 of my sisters predeceased her, and she never felt any self-pity or anything like that. She just stiff upper lip type of thing, I guess. But she was a very cheerful, happy woman. She always could find something good that was happening.
I think you've inherited that.
Well, I tell you, she was a marvelous inspiration to me, because I can still see her now walking down the corridors of Santo Tomas, always straight, always with a purpose. She never slackened and never felt sorry for herself and never complained. She was wonderful.
Well, that must have made your experience easier.
Much more bearable, yes. To share it with her. Yep. She was a great lady.
So is there one anecdote you want to add?
I can't think of anything.
Except for your cartoons.
Oh, my cartoons. I did do drew some cartoons. It was intended to be just a private thing for my mother, just the daily life of what it was like to be in Santo Tomas. And I gave it to her for, I think it was Christmas of 44. I'm not sure it was that long. It may have been earlier than that I gave it to her. And I had a Sawali cover on it that I had made, and it was just a private book for the two of us, really. In fact, the last page was never published. There's one page on the back where there's cobwebs drawn, and it says, "Whence cometh relief?" Release. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, somebody asked me if he could collect the cartoons and publish them, and he just did a wonderful job. These were in a pretty bad state of decay by then. They were poor paper, and done in pencil. So he had to clean up all the graphite and everything, and he published them, and I am very proud of what he did with them. I'm very happy with it.
This is not for your official thing, but since I'm going to send a copy to Jane, you can have a little message for Jane.
Oh! That's just one more of my pleasures during the wartime, was knowing Jane, and post-war knowing Jane and Bob, because they have been instrumental in, they were instrumental in seeing to it that my husband and I went to the Philippines in 1989 with the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor. My husband would never have gone without their inspiration. And then after I lost him, they were the ones who inspired me to attend one more meeting, and they just sort of guided me through it alone, because I had always attended these with my husband, but Jane and Bob were just so wonderful. I love them so much.